Previously on Hearts and Minds Aloud.
The only thing that I would say is sometimes what happens, especially when this happens in relationships early on, the victim ends up becoming a perpetrator.
Right.
Either within this cycle or in future cycles. Because they've learned that behavior.
Of course. So it's easy to play out that behavior even in a different situation. The episode last week started focusing on the details of abuse and how it sponsors long-term trauma. Why would a person who's visibly struggling in an abusive relationship still stay? It might not be that simple. Find out why in the concluding part of my episode with Dr. Shaima. And now, today's episode. Do you think that some people are more prone to getting into or staying into abusive relationship? For example, is there a character trait that would lead a person to, even when they realize that this person that I'm with is abusive, they don't necessarily do anything about it?
Honestly, I wouldn't.
Is there maybe a common character trait that you notice with abuse victims?
I wouldn't put in a certain characteristic just because a lot of times perpetrators, and I'll put it back on perpetrators, tend to be very charming.
Right.
So with specific characteristics that you would think, what's going on? That they're very charming, they're very approachable, they're very and then after a while, after you're hooked, then the other part comes out. So, I mean, who's not attracted to charming?
Yes.
I wouldn't put a label on the victims because you could be the strongest person ever, but then, and that's why I would say it's very easy to blame the victim and say, well, why didn't you just leave? It is not that easy to leave. If you've developed a bond, if you're in a relationship with that person, yes, I mean, technically, theoretically, by the book, you can say a person who has a weaker ego strength might be more prone. But in reality, I mean, who has the strongest ego strength?
Yeah.
If you're a 16-year-old with a very healthy upbringing, and healthy saying, basically, you've been loved, sheltered, and everything.
Yeah.
And then you get into a domestic violent relationship. Are you prone? Yeah. It's your first experience.
Exactly.
You are vulnerable. There's a lot of emotions. There's intimacy, and then you don't know any better. Is there a specific characteristic there? No, it's just timing.
Yeah.
So it's different for each person. I wouldn't put a label on the victim just because of how they would be perceived as well, and marginalized and blamed.
Exactly, which really makes it worse for them while they're still. Okay, so then as a friend or as a neighbor or a family member, what do you say to a person who you know is in an abusive relationship?
Always keep
still there.
Always keep the door open.
Right.
Do not try to convince them out of the relationship. They know that they need to get out. And trying to convince them out is only going to frustrate you.
Sure.
As a therapist, it frustrates me. But it's not my decision to make. I mean, if there are children involved and they're exposed to violence, then we're all mandated to report. I think in practically a lot of countries in the world.
Right.
Thankfully, UAE is one of them as well.
Okay.
So it's, if there are vulnerable children, I mean, even vulnerable adults or elderly who are exposed or who experience violence, then we're mandated to report.
Okay.
But if it's two adults, you can advise, at the end of the day, just be supportive and just be there. And understand that it's just not that easy to leave. Be a lending hand, but do not push, because that's just going to frustrate you. And then you getting frustrated just means that you might put even more boundaries with the relationship and push yourself away, where you could be a lifeline for that person when they decide and when they leave. I mean, I've come across some people who have planned their exit over 5 years. And the reason they do that is when they were first with the person, they didn't have the right degree for the right country. So they would make an exit plan of, okay, I'll get my master's, I'll get enough work experience, I'll do this, and I'll do all that so that and get enough money with all the correct paperwork so when it's time, I can get out.
Yeah.
So some people set themselves up to leave, but it's not that easy.
Yeah. What do you say to them when they eventually leave?
Well done. It's a big deal.
That's good enough, yes.
It's a big deal.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it's not easy. It's not like staying or leaving that there's less of a loss. You can have a loss in both ways.
True.
Sometimes you're leaving family. And sometimes the violence comes from your own family or comes from a culture that condones it. So you end up leaving a whole culture and a family that disapproves of your independence. Whereas, no, you're supposed to take it. This is your husband. So it's easier said than done. Just to empathize a little bit more with someone who's in that situation.
Okay. Okay. And what are some of the most common sentiments that people who survived abusive relationships express?
Loss is one of them. That's why I bring that up, because it's with
a common theme.
It's a common theme. But also a sense of achievement. Because that's another common theme that I've noticed with people who have managed to leave. People who have not managed to leave, the sense of the anxiety is overwhelming. Because there's constant self-doubt.
Right.
And they don't know if they're right or their partner's right or what's going on or is this in my head? There's a lot of, is this in my head?
Exactly.
I must be exaggerating this.
Right.
I must be, because there's psychological turmoil and torment.
Yeah.
There is the manipulation, and all of that comes with the process. So the sense of clarity after a person has left is stronger.
Right.
Whereas the self-doubt during a relationship and the anxiety is much higher.
Okay. And this is something that you've mentioned already, but I'll touch on again. So having worked with different cultural populations, I think you've answered this, but just to clarify, you believe that different cultures perceive or classify abuse differently?
Yes. And yes, because, I mean, look, obviously there's the big ones that is obvious across all. But like, for example, I worked with the African American community in the U.S. compared to the Caucasian community.
Exactly.
An open hand slap on the bum, for example, is commonplace and acceptable with the African American community, as opposed to Caucasian, which they would consider that child abuse.
Right. Yes.
So here, for example, there's no clear cut, but I've noticed here as well that people minimize child abuse here. Things have changed, thank God, but like the stick that the old men use to frighten children or hit them with it or whip them with it, I still think that's a little bit extreme, but people have gone through it.
Yes.
We're still trying to finalize what it is here and what people are willing to accept, and but how different cultures will perceive it, there's different. It has to be culturally appropriate.
Exactly.
But that does not mean that different cultures cannot be educated and be made to move forward and recognize the harms of such things.
Yes.
And this is where it's more universal, that if you neglect a child, it is child abuse. If you neglect a child and do not provide the correct care, the emotional care, humiliate a child and call them names, or it's just, this is universal, regardless of where we're from. With discipline, I mean, anything that, I don't know. Personally, I wouldn't, anything that hurts, I don't condone anything. But I think, like, in general, something with a closed fist is considered child abuse. Right. Whereas open hand and then the severe, if it leaves a mark, then it's considered child abuse. But if it's open hand and it doesn't leave a mark, then this is where it gets vague with different cultures. Although I personally don't condone any type of physical abuse. That's mainly it. Other than that, I mean, they're all big. And
this is an area of interest for me because I'm from Ghana, and I grew up with, being whipped, like being a big part of being disciplined. Like, you couldn't complain, because if you did, then you were the spoiled child. Like, how do you mean you won't be whipped? I mean, today, lots of parents are moving away from that. And there are still a few who, still do it. But a lot more people, kind of understand that there are ways to instill discipline or let a child understand that what they're doing is wrong, without using, physical contact or force or things like that. But I guess for me, coming from an environment like that, I understand the lines being blurred sometimes, or there being gray areas, because it's sort of you living your culture or what people have always known, as opposed to trying to use not necessarily modern methods, but maybe more useful methods, for bringing up children. I think same thing applies to relationships and marriages and all of that. Because yes, the wife leaving might in certain places be considered, and I use the wife because most of the time we find that women, end up being like suffering abuse a lot more. So leaving while in certain places might be considered like you being empowered and fighting for what's good for you. In other places, it would be you being, I don't know, not being patient enough or not being tolerant enough or whatever. So that was a very interesting thing for me. Okay, so the final question is to find out if there's an abuse survivor, a patient that you've worked with who made an impact in your life, or who left, I don't know, whose story stayed with you, like there was something very interesting about them, or about the work that you did with them. Would you be able to share maybe that there's some sort of a lesson that you learned from their story?
That we're a work in progress, definitely. Okay. Because I'm thinking of my work back in the US. Okay. And how even when clients try their hardest, sometimes they fall into their own traps. Right. I think that was eye-opening in the sense of we're people, we make mistakes. The particular person that I'm thinking of was a survivor of abuse. Okay. But because of it, got into a lot of addiction issues and lost her kids because of it. Oh. So she was trying to get her kids back. Okay. So we were working on the abuse and the addiction and all of that. Right. And she worked so hard and then relapsed. And I think it's that's why I kept saying it's just humbling. The more that I work in this field, the more humbling it is. Yeah. That we're fallible, we're human. Yeah. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of work to... People underestimate how much work we have to put in to better ourselves and others, and just in general, raise children, be in this world is just, and not to do it alone, and not having enough support not asking for help.
Yeah.
It's just things that, okay, sound simple, but easier said than done, especially in the world that we live in now, that condones independence, that separates families compared to the olden days where it takes a village to raise a child. Yeah, it does take a village. There's more and more proof of how much it does actually take a village. The mother needs support, the father needs support, the child needs support, everyone else around needs support, and we can't survive without each other. And I think that's the biggest lesson, is that the more that I work with people, the more that I can see how my ancestors were right all along.
Of course.
And the way life is going is separating and creating nuclear families where, I mean, you lived in the UAE and you saw how there's no such thing as a nuclear family. It's 10 people and that could be the smallest size family, but there's so much value to it.
Of course.
And it's underestimated. It's underestimated how valuable that is.
Yeah. And Shaima, thank you so much for your time. That's it for our conversation. Welcome. If you have any final words, I'll be happy.
Thank you so much, and I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you. I wish you same.
Thank you.
As adults, we go through many a traumatic experience. But I've just been reminded that children are probably more vulnerable to traumatic experiences than we are. Probably because they don't have complete control over the experiences that they go through as children, and also because they don't have the ability to process those experiences as we can as adults. So it emphasizes our role as parents, as guardians, as caregivers, to make the right decisions when it comes to discipline, for example, the methods of discipline. Or to remember that physically providing for children isn't enough. Being emotionally present is just as important. So when we know better, we definitely do better. One of the most important things that you can do for an abuse survivor is to just let them know that you are there, that your doors are open. It's so important to remember this, because sometimes we might go into overdrive thinking that we want to save people, but it's really not up to us to save them. They need to actually make a decision to save themselves. And sometimes when someone is minimizing what feels or what looks like an abusive relationship to us, it's not our place to judge, or it's not our place to make them feel less of a person, because guess what? Maybe minimizing it is what's made them survive till this point. So again, you just let them know that you're there, and let them understand that they can come to you whenever it is that they feel ready. I hope that this episode has been beneficial, interesting, educative, and useful, basically. I'd love to hear your comments, and I'd love to have your questions too. Thank you for making time to listen to this episode of Heart and Minds Aloud. I look forward to you joining us on our next episode. My name is Baba. If you haven't already, subscribe, rate, and like this podcast. We're on Instagram and Facebook as Hearts and Minds Aloud. Thank you for listening. Until next week.